This notion that there is a certain type of body that is the ideal body and the ideal mind. And if you don't conform to that, you are less than. But the reality of the matter is there is no ideal body and there is no ideal mind. We all are like completely different in our abilities, and that's just life.
What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. There is so much that we take for granted and we utilize on a daily basis that originally never existed and wasn't even designed for the greater community, but has only benefited every single person. Designs like the ramp that was originally designed for those in wheelchairs are now used by parents with strollers, delivery personnel, travelers with rolling suitcases, or even subtitles designed for deaf and hard of hearing individuals. But now it's used for people in loud environments like the gym and the airport. And let's be real, even when we need to be quiet and we put the volume all the way down at nighttime for late night viewing. And let's talk about text messaging, originally designed for deaf communities to communicate without sound, but now used by literally everyone. And we prefer texting over phone calls. These things that were originally advocated to help those with some form of disability to engage and be a part of society has only benefited everyone. And this is exactly what my next guest talks about. She's a host of her podcast, Down to the Struts, a podcast about disability, design, and intersectionality, where together with her guests, she uncovers the building blocks for a more just, inclusive, and accessible world, things that ultimately end up benefiting every single person. She's an advocate, she's an activist, and she has profoundly changed the way that people think about design, disability, and our inclusive community. So excited to talk to you today. This has been a long time coming, and I think that what you bring to the table is such a powerful conversation that the average person is just like not thinking about. And I want to start with, first of all, just big welcome to have you here and help reframe the perspective around disability and disability in our spaces and justice, and also just the function of everyday life.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Pyle. I'm really honored to be here and really excited to talk about this topic that I care a lot about.
Yeah, I want to just dive into asking you, actually I'm going to preface it a little bit that there's people who struggle with labels, and there's people who struggle with like, oh, being, put into all these different intersectionalities, but at the same time, sometimes giving context to that helps. But I want to just go right into the fact that, there's multiple layers as humans to all of us. And with you being, a woman of color, an immigrant, someone who is blind, there's so many layers that exist within you. And again, it's like without having to use these labels to like define us necessarily, but I'm just so curious that in your life, as you have moved through this, because this is your reality, what was the moment or the series of moments where you realized that your identity wasn't just something to accept, but something to just fully embrace and amplify?
And it's interesting that you mentioned labels because, in general, I feel that labels can be a challenge. On the one hand, they can pigeonhole you and they can put you in a box. And in my case, I feel like the label of disability, it didn't put me in a box. It actually sort of did the opposite. It set me free. And to explain that is a bit of a long story. Disability is a really interesting identity because it's one of the only identity or community that anyone can be a part of at any time. We become disabled in different ways as we age. Some people may lose their hearing as they age, or lose their vision, or lose their mobility, or, those things change over time. You can become temporarily disabled if you have an injury. For example, in 2021, I had a bike crash and I broke my collarbone and I couldn't use my left arm. So I was temporarily disabled in that way. And, disability, you could be born with a disability that is one way in your childhood, but then changes over time. So it's really this identity that's interesting in the sense that we all touch it. We all have a relationship with it in one way or another, whether it's in relation to our own body or our own mind, because of course there's also mental health, intellectual, developmental, all sorts of disabilities that affect our minds as well. So, and can touch our lives in all different kinds of ways. So often, for instance, on my podcast, Down to the Struts, which is about disability design and intersectionality, I often ask people, rather than asking them kind of, what is your disability? Or usually I ask a question that's more along the lines of, what is your relationship to disability? Or what can you describe your disability journey? And so for me, I have a eye condition. I was the only person in my family that had it. It was a degenerative condition, so it worsened over time. So when I was young, I always had night blindness, but I could see really well in the day. I could read print, and then that kind of changed over time, and things evolved. So I felt really alone in that experience. I didn't really know anyone else who was blind, or like no one who openly said, I am a disabled person, and had that sort of social and political identity in that way. And it's interesting just because my parents had kind of, they were immigrant parents. I had this really interesting conversation with my mom where I asked her just recently, do you know what the Americans with Disabilities Act is? She didn't know. And, I was a pre-ADA baby. The ADA passed when I was 6 years old in 1990. And, we were just a family. They knew my parents were both physicians, and they were trying to figure out how to treat my condition, whether it was treatable, how to monitor it. They were dealing with all those medical things. But then at the same time, my mom was trying to get me services. And they also really did try. Like, once they took me to a summer camp for disabled kids. And I got out of the car, I looked around, and I was like, I don't identify with this. This isn't who I am. And I wanted to get in the car and go back home. And they took me back home because I completely resisted it. And I think that was them trying. But then at the same time at home, that notion wasn't normalized for me at home. So of course, when I come into this environment with all these disabled kids who I would realize much later on were like me, I couldn't get there. And it wasn't until I was 30 years old and I moved to Washington, D.C. I was more than 30. I think I was like 32, 33. And I moved to Washington, D.C. and I had a boss who really was a mentor to me, who took me to an event. I'm an attorney, so it was a lawyer-related, like, professional event. And she introduced me to a blind woman, a blind lawyer. And that was the beginning for me. And a very long answer to your question, but that was the turning point. So I met her, and at first we laugh about it now, but we both were kind of like, oh God. Initially we thought it was like, oh, she thinks that, like, I'm blind, you're blind, we're going to be friends, or some nonsense like that. But then we got to know each other, and we discovered we have a very shared love of athletics. Like, she was a runner, she was a cyclist. And she was starting this sports group, the Metro Washington Association of Blind Athletes, to create recreational opportunities for the blind community in DC. And she kept pestering me and encouraging me to come and try tandem cycling. And I was like, oh, there's no way. I haven't been on a bike since I was a kid. I'm going to fall off. It's going to be a mess. Like, I don't know about this. But I finally came begrudgingly. And then I met all these other people. And that is really when I started to realize that's when I was set free from my box. Wow. I wasn't just a person who was visually impaired or whatever, who had all these limitations. I was a person who was part of a community. And there were lots of other people with a shared lived experience. And that was the most powerful moment or series of moments of my life, and just completely changed my trajectory.
Wow. I mean, so many moments in there that I want to dive into. Like the first one being that, just not wanting to associate yourself at first, right? With like, I'm not them. That's not who I am, and also taking back one step even further is when you were saying like, well, this is something that affects everyone at some point all the time. So to even think of disability as like, oh, this is a separate group than, just anyone else, it's like, no, 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 that's not how it functions. And you saying that immediately, I'm like, yeah, you know what? Like I have multiple chronic illnesses but I don't necessarily associate myself with thinking like, oh, that's a form of, possible disability or whatever it is. But it's like, because of this illness, like it does cause me a lot of limitations and things that I can do on a daily basis. And it's like, well, that is a form of something, but you don't think about it from that angle because I'm thinking like, well, I can see, I can hear, I can move, I can do all these things. So, being able to really see that connecting thread between everyone, and it's like knowing like, yeah, like I have a father who's losing his hearing and like, you can tell, and it's like, okay, we've given him noise canceling headphones so he listens to the TV with that instead of making it really loud for everybody else. But that right there is really powerful because I don't think people see that this is something that is, it's not a separate than you, it is a part of like all of us.
There's a really wonderful book, and I interviewed the author of this book for my podcast. Her name is Jennifer Natalia Fink, and she wrote this book called All Our Families. And it's basically the essential argument of it is we really lose something. I loved what you said about your dad. We lose something when we erase disability from our actual, like our family of origin, our family lineage. And oftentimes in the disability community, there's a lot of people like me who like look outside of their family to find disability community because they feel alienated from their family. They're like, no one else in my family is like me. But then if we start to uncover our own familial relationship with disability and we like actually like acknowledge that more openly as a family, like I have members of my family who are had or are experiencing hearing loss. They may not necessarily identify as having a disability in the way that I do, but there is disability in my lineage. And if we all just kind of embraced that, and I think people, like, it would just be much more acculturated into our culture that disability is just a normal part of life. But there's so much stigma attached to it. And I think that's a fundamental problem. Disabled people are thought of as less than. They were forcibly sterilized. Our immigration laws were built on the foundation of what is called ableism. So belief that people with disabilities are inferior, eugenics, all of these things, what underlies all of them is this notion that there is a certain type of body that is the ideal body and the ideal mind. And if you don't conform to that, you are less than. But the reality of the matter is there is no ideal body and there is no ideal mind. We all are like completely different in our abilities, and that's just life. And I used to feel so much stigma about using a white cane or doing anything that like, because I don't like look blind, quote unquote. Like you can't tell just by looking at me that I'm blind. So I was able to kind of like mask and hide, and it was exhausting. It was totally exhausting. So when I met these other blind people and they all were hanging out with their canes and their voiceover and their braille and all the things, I started to see that not as stigmatizing, but rather, oh, this is our community and this is our culture and this is what we do in our culture and this is how we communicate. This is how we are together. And I just don't care anymore about those things. Like I don't even think about them. Whereas like if you asked me 15 years ago if I would walk down the street with my white cane, that would be such a difficult, painful thing for me to do. Whereas now it's just like my cane is like my like fifth limb,
Yeah, no, I mean, so taking to that, right, when you're saying like bringing it back into our families, like how are you able to bring it back into your family? How are you able to normalize it, within your own parents, your cousins, siblings, whoever it is, right? Like what was that like for you?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that's something that's still complicated. And because everyone's relationship, it's a journey. And I am on a certain place in that journey. And I am where I am, and my family, various members of my family are where they are. But I think it's definitely allowed for more open conversation about disability. And I've definitely heard feedback from my family of, things that you say on your podcast, things that you tell us, the conversation we have has really caused me to examine these issues in a different way. And like, I think for me, it's actually helped me, like, family members who are experiencing hearing loss or whatnot, to kind of meet that with a little bit more compassion and a little bit more understanding, and find ways within the family to like create access for people, which is like the ultimate goal of acknowledging disability. Because when we acknowledge it and we recognize that people have different bodies and minds, that they have different needs, then the thing that starts to happen is that we create access for one another. There's a wonderful sort of hashtag that was developed a few years ago by these three disability justice activists, Alice Wong, Mia Mingus, and Sandy Ho. It's hashtag access is love. And that is such a beautiful concept. This notion that when we create access for each other, when we describe an image for our loved one who may have low vision or be blind, or we make sure there's ASL at an event, or we make sure there's sign languages in another language when it's needed, or when we make sure that people in a wheelchair can get in the door for whatever gathering we're having and can move around freely, that is an act of love. And that is what is so, to me, felt so joyous about having like disability as an identity. And it's not just a label. It's not just a way to describe ourselves or identity or a group of people. It's also a way of life. It's transformative in the sense that it changes the way we think about how we relate to one another, how we relate to the built or the digital environment.
Wow. When you're talking about this, it's like what I really am thinking about is like it's accessibility, but it's just simply about like embracing the fact that like, okay, yeah, we're all a part of the same society. It's not an afterthought. It's not a idea of like, oh, we should, when we're thinking about even, for example, design, right? Home design, we're thinking about building design, street design, like all of these things. This shouldn't be a like, okay, here we're making our design. Oh, and then did we do this extra lane for, someone with disability? Cool, check. No, it's like, no, that's already woven into the beginning, questioning the dialogue of the conversation of like, hey, what does it mean to build a road or a pathway or a neighborhood that is easily accessible, like driveways where, we have to pay attention to the curbs, like things like this, where like, like even I remember when the crosswalk started the sounds, like that wasn't there before. And I remember when that became a thing, or like the countdown of like 10, 9, like walk,
Oh,
walk,
the auditory
stop.
pedestrian signals.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Like that was not like that came, I think either in the late 90s or early 2000s, I think it was, but it was just that, just even those things, right? It's like, to be honest, that helps everybody. Like that's just not, and so I think it's like what I'm really hearing is how do we not look at disability or communities of that as like the other group that we have to like now just like open space for, but it's more of like, hey, like we're all here. We all benefit from this. We all need, access to these things. So like, let's talk about it. Like, how do we do that? Right. And so I think it's what you're talking about really is just, again, like us just coming together as a group, and we're all able to kind of like create something and be more innovative, if anything, about like, what would a world look like where things aren't an afterthought?
Yeah, and I think that's what disability justice is really starting to create. So, a little bit more about that concept because I keep mentioning it. So,
Yeah.
there's the concept of disability rights. So, this was a movement of kind of really that came about in the mid 20th century, and it was all about how do we end discrimination on the basis of disability and how do we create access. And it created really important laws and concepts like reasonable accommodations. So the idea that someone should have what they need to participate if they have a disability in any kind of activity. And it really opened up the pathway for people with disabilities to have greater access to things like employment, healthcare, transportation, so many different things. So the disability justice movement kind of came about in the early 2000s, and it was both a critique of disability rights and also building upon what the disability rights movement accomplished. So the critique was, this is great, but this movement really came about. It's very sort of centered on the needs and the experiences of white disabled people. it's very sort of capitalistic in the sense that it focuses on, access to employment, like kind of how do we increase the productivity of disabled people and that sort of thing. And then also it has this process of, in order to get redress, you have to complain. So there's a certain extent to which disability rights, like, sort of created like standards for access that could be universally implemented. But most of the time, what you were doing is, okay, I was discriminated against, or this thing isn't accessible. Okay, I'm going to have to bring a lawsuit. That's really expensive. That takes a long time. And, the disability justice folks were kind of like, well, why don't we have a more holistic attitude toward this, a more kind of what you were saying, Payal, like starting from the beginning, we're all here in the space, physical, digital, whatever it is. And how can we all exist in this space together, taking into account the various needs of all people? And then finally, the last critique is it doesn't sort of consider what it is to be disabled and to be Black, to be disabled and to be an immigrant, to be disabled and be queer. It's not thinking about how those things kind of intersect and compound and create kind of these unique ways in which people can be discriminated against. And so they developed these 10 principles, intersectionality being the first of them. And then the other one that I wanted to kind of get to that relates to this conversation that we're having is collective access. This idea that we are all kind of communally responsible for creating access for one another. And that is like the way in which our community should come about. And something else that's grown out of that is this concept of critical design. So there's this wonderful advocate and designer, Amy Hamrai, who runs the Critical Design Lab at Vanderbilt University. And they have written really deeply and much better than I could ever say it about this notion of looking critically at the way in which things are designed. So understanding, in the same way, we talk about, a lot recently about systemic racism, or about how exclusion is sort of systematized in the way in which we design our world, and thinking about how access can be a solution for that challenge.
Wow. Yeah. So with everything that you're talking about with the accessibility piece of it, and, and to go back actually a couple steps where first initially it was just this like, the lawsuits or like the complaining and all of those pieces. But, something that connects to those two pieces is like of the one, it's like how it initially started to like where it is today is to get the average individual on board to like understanding. Like, I think that one of the things that looking at what we're doing when it comes to disability, or what we're doing when it comes to like marginalized systemic racism, any of these challenges or issues, right? It's not just necessarily, talking about the one issue on its own, because there are so many complex overlapping that are happening. And I think so much of that goes back to the narrative that we're shaping in our culture and society about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And how do you see that? Because justice, like, of course, policy is what helps to enforce the things to happen. But so much of it is driven by culture, by behavior, and how we move through the world. Like, and if anything, I kind of feel like culture and behavior and how we move through the world actually is the thing that ends up dictating policy to be passed. Would you agree, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think they're very intertwined. And so, for example, like, I think that, make no mistake, the disability rights laws are essential. They're essential because they create the floor. They really like serve to protect people. It's really important to have the ability to file a complaint, to file a lawsuit, to hold folks to account, to follow the law. That is really, really critical. But I think this question of like, chicken or the egg with culture and law, I think they're just really, really intertwined. For example, with the disability rights laws, they were passed, and then there was like all this resistance. The first 10 years of the ADA was spent on litigation that was trying to figure out what is a disability and what is not a disability. And it was just a lot of, and then there was the ADA Amendments Act was passed to kind of clarify and like the definition itself in the law is very, very broad, intentionally so, to be inclusive. And then there was all this hemming and hawing and hand-wringing by judges about, oh, well, this is in and this is, and if you can fix your disability temporarily, then it's not a disability, and like all these different things. So that to me demonstrated the law was there, but as you said, the culture hadn't really changed and there was a lot of resistance. And I think culture informs policy, and policy can also push culture, because I think, the disability rights laws forced this reckoning about what is the place of disabled people in society. But then, the culture still had further to go. And I think that's another aspect of disability justice that I really love, which is that it is like creating this sense of community and a culture around being disabled. And there's so many good examples of that. One other person that I interviewed, whose name is Lachi, who is a musician and helped to start Ramped, recording artists and music professionals with disabilities, is really trying to bring disability culture. So she and Ramped did a lot of work to make the Grammys accessible, to have ASL and audio description at the Grammys. And they always make a huge showing on the red carpet with, she has these things called glam canes. She also has low vision, and she uses these like bedazzled, like gorgeous, cool looking canes that match her outfits, and it's awesome. So really kind of normalizing and like making disability more visible. Another person who has really done that is this incredible disability justice activist, Alice Wong, who wrote a book called Disability Visibility and has an entire project called the Disability Visibility Project, which also had its own podcast, which is really trying to bring disability into the forefront of culture. And there's also, been a ton of effort to have really realistic, non sort of inspiration porn or tragedy narrative disabled characters in TV shows and movies and things like that. So there's really, that's where culture comes in and storytelling. And that was really like the impetus for starting my podcast. One of the impetuses was, just myself trying to understand my own community and my own identity, and by talking to other people. So there was a selfish element to it, but also there was an element of wanting to amplify all of these people that I keep mentioning who are really trying to reshape the culture in a way that I think is pushing the policy in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, the thing that keeps coming up for me as you're talking is so much of, again, it's like, when you're mentioning about the Grammys, you're mentioning about like the bedazzled cane, you're mentioning about, just the visibility of disability and all of these pieces. It's just like the thing that just keeps really strongly coming up for me is just like the normalization of, right? Like the normalization of that. Like, I feel like for a long time, and, probably in the 80s or when you grow up, or like, I'm sure it still exists in certain places where they don't, broaden their thoughts perspective about this stuff. But it's like, this idea of like, oh, they're different. Oh, they don't want what we have. Like, they don't want, like, it's almost this concept and idea that like the way that someone who, again, is quote unquote able, and, our life is just so different and unique to like what someone with disability, like we see it, for example, like even with Asperger's or like autism or Down syndrome. And people have just decided like, oh yeah, like, they wouldn't want a relationship. They wouldn't want to get married. And now it's like, no, like Netflix has like shown, like they have like a reality show on like, Down syndrome and love. And like, it's just, it's reshaping the way that people are like, oh, wait a second. Like, yeah, why? Just because they have Asperger doesn't mean that they don't want to be loved. Like they don't want to have a partnership. Right. And I think there's so much of breaking even those like stereotypes for society, people, communities, that like, someone who belongs to I won't even say belong, because we all belong to many multiple, sections of life and stuff, like whether it's cultural, gender, whatever it may be for any individual. But it's that doesn't define what kind of a life you can and cannot have.
Yeah. And I think, the disability culture does something else that I think is perhaps like more delicious, which is just challenging the very concept of normality itself.
Yes.
What is normal? Oftentimes that is, in our Western society, is often pegged to, a white cis straight male. We don't even realize that we're doing it, but we're sort of, that's the basic, and it's trying to blow that up entirely and say nothing. There's no such thing. There's no such thing. We all exist. We all have different bodies and minds and different ways of being in the world, and it's all valuable. And I think the other principle of disability justice, one of the 10 that I really sort of latch onto, is this kind of anti-capitalist politics. So this idea of we are not just a means of production, which is kind of very typical in our Western society of, your value is determined by your productivity in one way or another way, whether it's a job or something else. And, disability,
are you a productive member of society?
Right. And disability culture is really just, no, I am not, it's not I do, therefore I am. It is I exist, therefore I am. And I think that is really radical. And I think that is really important. And it's something, to me, I feel that, my own, because the other thing in the disability rights movement, it was always about there's a few narratives of the disabled person, right? There's the overcomer. There's the person who, that's where kind of the concept of inspiration porn come from, of you're such an inspiration. The fact that you can walk down the street if you're blind is just incredible.
Wow.
The fact that you can leave your house is amazing, and it's not actually.
Or even Paralympics, right? Paralympics and is wow, look at this, quadriplegic. Oh my God, I'm going to butcher the name.
Quadriplegic,
yes, thank
basketball player or whatever it is. And you're just kind of you've overcome your
right
quote,
to be
limitation.
One of us.
Yeah. And then there's this narrative of, oh, you're just, oh, what a tragedy. It's such a crying shame that, you have this, and it's terrible. But, the reality of it is our experiences as disabled people are neither. They are just, we're just humans trying to live our lives, and we do it in different ways, and everyone does it in different ways. And I think that's even just breaking down, what is normal? What is normative? Is that even real? I think that's the thing I love about disability culture, is that it really challenges that idea.
Hi, so I'm pausing the episode for a quick moment and for a quick favor. If you haven't already, if you could just click subscribe, leave a review wherever you're listening to this episode, it would be really helpful. The only way we can know to make sure that we provide the right type of podcast episodes, the right type of guests, and to make sure that we're delivering the type of content that you actually want to hear, it's through your reviews and through your support. Thanks. And now back to the episode. Before we started recording, we talked about the labeling and putting meaning behind the labels, right? And it's the meaning of disability. Some people feel oh my God, I can't use that word. It feels awkward for me to say that word. Or it's now it's another word, even when it comes to the homeless community, it's just you can't say homeless, it's unhoused. And, it's we put attention to words, and the meaning of that is really what's driving it. I'm so curious, just your perspective about how much we focus on the meaning of the word versus the actual act and the work behind that we really need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. Words can be important, especially when we reclaim them. I think the term disability or CRIP, these are all terms that have kind of been reclaimed by the community, and I think that they can be important in the sense that they create community, and they create a sense of political or social power that people can rally themselves around. And, in disability community, there's just a lot of, I'm sure you've heard or are familiar a little bit with these debates about do you say person with a disability or disabled person? So in the disability rights movement, it was really the idea behind, we want to be persons with disabilities because we are people first. It's person first language. Whereas, that has sort of shifted where some people prefer disabled person because that's, identity first language, because their disability is not apart and separate from themselves. It's a part of who they are. It's part of their identity. And, I think I would answer to both. I kind of use them interchangeably. I often ask people what they prefer, but I do think that the language can be important. Again, like the term crip is something that's been reclaimed. It's kind of a derivation of the term cripple. And it has resulted in building a movement and, allowing people to organize around this idea. For example, there was a film that came out a number of years ago called Crip Camp. And that was a film about the disability rights movement. And there were a lot of different important characters, one of whom was a woman named Judy Heumann, who really was one of the key activists and advocates that was able to ensure that the non-discrimination laws that protect people against disabilities were enforced by the federal government, staged one of the largest sit-ins in our history, and was able to get regulations passed that would promulgated that would then enforce the non-discrimination law, which is called Section 504. And I think using those terminologies it's an organizing tool. It can be anyway. And I think when it's used as such, it can be very, very powerful. And yeah, I was very privileged to be able to interview Judy before she passed away a couple of years ago. And it was just illuminating to hear about how these different terms and slogans and things were used in the movement to help organize people and around these ideas.
Yeah, I guess and I totally hear that. It's like the words can create that movement. It creates a unifying feeling for people of what this means for me. And especially I think when you reclaim that word, right? But how do you go from being able to reclaim that word, using that word as a place of meaning, but also inviting others in to understand versus it becoming this feeling of, and we see that happen, right? Of course, there was BLM and then there's Blue Lives Matter. It's just, it can create even that offset of there's a group that stands for something. And so then it immediately sets off another group to being well, now we have to the opposition of versus how do you create it where this is a word we're reclaiming. This is who we are. This is the identity that we're passing by, but we welcome you to really understanding this and kind of coming into, helping us being seen and being visible. And, again, just nothing to see that as if it's, because I think what happens with human behavior, and this just goes back to our natural biology, is that, anything that's different, we consider a threat, even if it's good for you, even if it's just anything new is considered a threat. You could be eating pizza every day and then you convert to eating a broccoli. And now your stomach and your body is just having a whole fit because it's what is this new thing that you've introduced to my body? Right. So it's that's just how we function. And so when you have, a community that's feeling celebrated within themselves, which is amazing, but how are you inviting others in to also celebrate, this community, and also again, create it where it's it's accessible for everyone to understand this experience.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. And I think in movement spaces, this is often the critique, right? Of you have to have the right words, you have to be a certain way, otherwise you're out. And I think that's challenging. And in a disability, the idea of calling in, which I'm so glad you brought up, is really important because there's so many people. So according to the CDC, 1 in 4 US adults has a disability. Wow. Now, I don't think 1 in 4 US adults would call themselves disabled or use the word disability necessarily. Some would, I do, but others do not. But they still deserve to be considered in the community and to be heard. And, and I think that requires grace, and also it requires, I'm a huge fan of, disability justice and disability studies and all these things. But sometimes I think we just get so wrapped up in conceptualizing that it's still important to make things, like you said, accessible. So to share these concepts, but in a way that people can, just the average person can understand, so that we can start to get them to rethink how they think about disability. And I think that is actually something that I talked about in my interview with Judy. And that was her kind of advice was, I think it's great that we have, people who are really in the culture and who have this identity and do the politics and all that stuff. But we can't forget that we still are facing a world where most people do attach negative connotations to that word, attach negative connotations to any sort of mental or physical impairment. And we have to think about how we reach those people on a plane that they can receive and understand. And, another podcaster colleague of mine, his name is Thomas Reed. He has a podcast called Read My Mind Radio. And not only is he a superb, one of the most skilled and talented audio producers I've ever met, but his whole podcast is about, the tagline is stories of people who are adjusting to all levels of blindness and disability. And the whole point of his show is to meet people where they are, talk about their journey and like how they're adjusting, because it is an adjustment. And, there's some aspects of disability that totally suck sometimes and are not fun and are hard. It's not like it's just, I think that's the other problem with like the concept of pride. I think we need to like complicate that a little bit in the sense of, yes, we should have pride in our identity, but also like leave space and grace for people for whom like having chronic pain or chronic illness or blindness or death, whatever, is really hard on some days. And that's okay. And you can be like, you can hold that and also hold your pride,
Yeah, I think that that's the piece right there. Is it's just, having that compassion and that space for, the existence of. And I think that normalization, and that's kind of what I think before when I was thinking about like, how do you shift culture and how do you shift behavior? Because I do think so much of that, does inform then how future generations like make things more acceptable. Like what we consider so normal and in quotes normal and acceptable today. I think if like someone from like 1850 was to be like reincarnated and born today and we're like, hey, like, or brought back from the dead to be like, look at the world today in 2025, they would probably be like, what is going on? Like, I don't know. Like, did you bring me to a different planet? Like, what's happening here? Right. Like, it's just like, that is part of, I think, just the evolution of society. And I think the other piece is that accepting that change takes time. And it's not an overnight thing. It's not going to maybe even happen like in our own, lifetime. It's for certain types of changes to happen. But it's like being able to also just celebrate in the small micro wins of what's happening. I think is just so much more important or as much important as like the bigger transformational changes, because those micro changes are what literally make, our culture shift in the way that we want it to.
Yeah. And I love what you're saying about ancestry and, people coming back from the past. The other thing that I think I often find problematic is when I talk about like my family of origin, I'm South Asian, my family originates from Central India. And I always hated like in sort of American, like when I've talked to people that like white people who are disabled or whatnot, that, it's cultural, like, it's just a cultural thing that like your culture doesn't accept disability. Mm-hmm. And I take issue with that. I think there are so many examples in our ancestry across cultures of people creating access and being inclusive in ways that we aren't today, that we can learn from. And I think like that is really important to remember and to look to other, places and spaces that have done this for generations, and to be reminded that, sometimes the solutions aren't so complicated. And I think that's something that we lose. And, there's a lot of cultures of inclusion, access that we see. And again, like, I think that's like another sort of critique of the disability justice movement, is that we have so much wisdom in our communities, in Black communities, in brown communities, in Asian communities, all over the place, Latinx communities, of how we do access and inclusion. And like, we need to look to those and also look to the past for solutions.
Yeah. So, speaking of that, like the cultural nuance and the ancestry, and just like, we put so much emphasis on like, where we are today versus where we were yesterday. And you're right. Like there's so many things that, may not exist today that did before, and we let it go and we have no recollection of it or history of it. So we don't know. Mm-hmm. But, It's even with, as you're thinking forward and as you're thinking about, like you said, right? Like when you interviewed Judy, it's like she said that like there's so many people that still just don't get it and they just don't understand it. So like if you were to just like in very simple terms, like in very simple examples of like how can, someone who thinks about disability or who thinks about, people in their lives, how can they start to like form a little bit of that compassion? Like, for example, I'll give an example here is that, like I said, like my dad, like he's lost hearing in one side of his ear, right? And so when he sits on his couch, he's got his spot on the couch that he sits on. It's always his corner, but the kitchen is like, to the side where he can, like the ear that he can hear out of is like, closest to the kitchen. And then the ear that he can't is, sitting in the living room is. So when you're in the kitchen and you've got the water running and you've got everything going, he can't hear the conversation that's happening in the living room because that's his good ear. And so being mindful of the fact that if he's on the phone or if he is, trying to like have a conversation or whatever it is, that maybe that's not the time to like, turn on the disposable and just like having, your
Yeah.
garbage disposal going
Yeah,
off and
exactly.
like, turning the water on and things like that. Like, it's like, that's just an extra level. And instead of thinking about it as like like this extra step, it's just thinking about it as like, how can I have compassion for, this challenge that is like, it's not like he wants it. It's frustrating, it's just like, but it is his reality. So it's like, what is one thing we can do? Okay, we can make sure you just don't turn the water on when he's on a phone or whatever it is. Or like, for example, gave him noise canceling headphones so that we can sleep well when he, stays up till 1 a.m. watching
Watching TV really
TV.
loud. Yeah.
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 But it's like,
Yeah.
what would
No.
be things that, you would say that like, how can someone think of it less as a like, oh, I have to do this thing and more of like a, okay, I understand why, it's important for me to take that extra, like that compassion step. I don't even call it an extra step. I just want to say a step of compassion.
Yeah. And also, another way to think about it, the way I would think about it is how do I design the environment
Mm-hmm.
and my actions in a way that creates access? And there are little things like, for example, in my house, my husband and I have an understanding that glassware, because I just have a tendency to knock stuff over when I don't see it, or if it's in a place that I'm not expecting it to be, glassware goes in the sink or it goes in one place where I know all the glassware is and there isn't glassware everywhere. And that's something he does to create access for me. And, he is dealing with some very prolonged like arm injury, so he can't lift things. So I create access for him by like doing all the lifting. And so that's collective access. And that's also another principle of disability justice, which is interdependence, another one that I really love. So in the disability rights movement, it was all about how do we make disabled people or people with disabilities as independent as possible. And like independence is kind of defined as you should be able to do everything yourself. And like that's great. And I think there are like for the purposes of dignity, that is helpful. But the reality of the matter is, and this is why I love the concept of interdependence, is we can't exist in the world without one another. That is just the
Mm-hmm.
reality. And being able to, some people at some points in time, I might need to take more, you might need to take more, but we rely on each other. And that's just the truth of things. And I think that is really, example of how I think we can actually operationalize these things. I love the example you gave of your dad. I mean, same thing. Like my parents have like are like losing some of their hearing, and one thing I do is like I used to just like be frustrated when he like couldn't hear me if his back was turned because he couldn't see me, so he couldn't hear me. And now I just kind of I'm like, okay, his back is turned, he's washing the dishes. I'm just gonna go around and like tap him on the shoulder or like start talking to him closer to him so he can hear me. And that's like access that I'm affording to him. And I'm not thinking about it as anything other than that. And there are certainly things he does for me that give me access. And I think it's such a beautiful concept, access, because it can be applied to like in so many different contexts in so many different ways. Another like classic example in the disability movement that we often use is the idea of curb cuts, which you mentioned a little bit earlier. Originally curb cuts, which are those, kind of ramps in the sidewalk at the end of a block or at a crosswalk, were the result of very hard fought advocacy on the part of wheelchair users. But who benefits from curb cuts? People with strollers, people with luggage, people who have bad backs, people, all sorts of people. So the other, beauty of access is when we think about designing for one type of need, we kind of often inadvertently meet like, all these other needs. And then there's just a benefit to everybody, like you
I
said.
think what you're talking about, and with everything that you just said as well, is just like, again, I think it's a difference between individualistic thinking versus collective. And I think that that's where, obviously in the West and specifically here, like, America has been extreme on its individualistic, like, values, which leads to this whole idea of like me over us. But I think that that does seem to be changing just a little bit. And I'm seeing that with the younger generations as well. But what you're talking about is just like, it really is that it takes a village for anything, right? Like a new mom, it's like the idea that a parent and like two parents are supposed to raise this child while both working full time is absolutely absurd, and this was again something that was created out of capitalism, something that was created, but that didn't exist. Like, I mean, take it back to like even just prior to industrial revolution, like in the farming, and you still see that, like, it's like joint families, like living in, if not joint family, like living in a collective society that everyone pours in, like, that's a value that a lot of like small towns still hold. This is a part of that reality. And I think that it's taking that approach of like, it takes a community to like exist. I mean, if we, again, just being a history nerd and a human behavior nerd, it's just like knowing that, well, even us as a human species, the ones that have thrived and successfully existed is because we existed as a community that supported each other to exist to this point. It was a survival mechanism, is, coming together as a community. It was, anyone who became a lone wolf and an individual going off on their own more than likely was going to be eaten by a lion or bear, or like, have some danger, and they didn't have any kind of other protection to help them. So again, it just, to me, it's like collective thinking is a is a way that we're able to actually get out of survival mode, and we're able to get out of, survival thinking, and we're able to then think about us as what benefits us as a collective society that allows us to all thrive. And yeah, it may be to a little bit of a disservice to the individual, but it's like the greater success, to your point of like, who does the curb cut benefit? It benefits everybody. Who does any of the noise canceling headphones benefit? It benefits everybody, including when you're on a flight and you don't have to hear screaming babies, right? Like, you're able to put those headphones on. It benefits every single person to some degree. So to think of it as it's only for one or the other, or why should we make a product that only supports this one group? Well, I'm sure if we actually did the historical research on why a lot of our innovations exist, it existed for a problem at one point, but it solved many after.
Yeah, and another critique or issue that comes up with disability is like this design of like a separate thing for the
Yeah.
disabled person. And like, no, just think about user test. Think about the needs of a variety of different people in your initial design. Kathy Martinez, who used to do disability work at Wells Fargo and was deputy assistant secretary in the labor department for many years, she was like, access is something that should be baked in and not bolted on. And I think that is such a like simple, clean way of expressing that, is that we should think about the needs of a lot of different users when we create something. And I think the other piece of this, which is something that is a slogan of the disability rights movement, it started in actually the disability rights movement in South Africa, is this slogan of nothing about us without us. And I think that's another aspect of what you're talking about, not only this idea of the collective and the interdependence, but also that people need to have a voice in aspects of life, in decisions that directly affect them. And I think the disability community has done a really good job of this, of making sure that their voice is heard when it comes to anything that affects them, whether that's transportation or access to the web, whatever the case may be. And I think that is also just a really critical aspect, is making sure that people's voices are heard in that experience of interdependence.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I feel like I could keep talking to you about this, and it's such an important issue that, like you said, I want to circle it back to the fact that this is something that affects every single person. So, no one can think of it as like, oh, well, this has nothing to do with me. It's like, no, 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 it does. It absolutely does. So, to leave you with one final question and one final thought, like you're doing a lot of incredible work in this space, obviously, but if you could just think about that one reframe that you would want society to have, and that could influence what the next 50 years looks like, for us as a community, as a culture, like what would that one reframe be that, people can leave with thinking about or applying?
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a page out of the book of Alice Wong, Mia Mingus, and Sandy Ho. So full credit. But I would say the reframe, I would say, is access is not a burden. Access is love, is the one reframe. If we could reorient ourselves in that direction, I think we would all be much better off as a society.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for being on. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I really hope that, and I know it will, that just like things have shifted in the last 20 years, that the next decade is going to show also a big transformation in a more collective way of thinking of all of us.
I wish for that too, and I'm hopeful as well. And thank you so much for having me.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.